Welcome students to your information technology and its application in business class. In today's class, we are going to continue with Unit 1, that is Information Technology and Business. The topic for today's class is Types of Information System. Now under these types of information system, we are going to cover up those types of information system which have been provided in your syllabus. Right? So let us begin with the class. First type of information system that we are going to learn, that is Transaction Processing System or TPS. Now in this system, the word transaction is there. What does this word transaction means? A transaction means an event that generates or modifies data that is eventually stored on an information system. Right? So let us see what does this system, this TPS means. Now a transaction processing system consists of computer hardware and software hosting a transaction-oriented application that performs the routine transactions necessary to conduct business. In other words, if we want to define this transaction system, so we can say that this transaction processing system, it supports the recording and processing of huge volume of transaction with the help of various hardware such as computers, scanners, card swiping machines, etc., and the software such as accounting software, spreadsheet, word processing, and other softwares. Right? Now the emphasis under this particular system, this transaction processing system, has to be given on routine transactions. Right? So this TPS, what does it do? It records, it classifies, it organizes, it stores, maintains and retrieves daily transactions on a systematic basis. So we have to keep in mind the term routine transactions to be performed under the transaction processing system. So the examples include systems that manage sales order entry, airline reservations, payroll, employee records, manufacturing, shipping, and many more. In other words, this system, it automates the processing of the transaction in such a way so that the financial statements, they also get prepared by the software without manual intervention. Right? So this is what about transaction processing system. Let us see the features or the characteristics of transaction processing system. First, rapid response. That is, fast performance with a rapid response is very important. It's very critical. Input must become output within a fraction of seconds so that the users or the customers, they don't have to wait for the output. Right? Next, reliability. Of course, any type of system should have the reliability in its feature. So the organizations, they heavily rely on their transaction processing system, those who have implemented it, to avoid the failure possibly stopping the business. For that, the backup and recovery procedures must be quick and accurate. Right? Next, inflexibility. Now a transaction processing system wants every transaction processed in the same way regardless of the user of time, because the settings of the system, the processing area of the system, it's of unique that will process the same type of transactions that has been provided to it. Right? So if it were flexible, there would be too many opportunities for non-standard operations also. Right? Next, controlled processing. Yes, the processing must support an organization's operations, and it should have the controlling nature so that unwanted user or malicious users, they cannot enter the system, they cannot destroy the processing system or the processing or the data or the output, whatever the system is having, whatever the operations are being done by the system, they should have proper control, or they should be properly kept secured, and the restriction regarding their usage should be there. Means their access permission to be controlled. Only those relevant people or the user, they require access to the system or to the processing system, must be given access to them only, not to any other person. So the controlled processing feature is one of the characteristics or the feature of any transaction processing system. Right? Next, we move on to the components. So what does a transaction processing system has? What are its components? First, the important thing is input. Now for any type of system, in order to run, it should have the first component, that is inputs, that is the source. With that source, it will start its processing to provide its output. Right? So these are the source documents received from transaction, which serve as inputs to the computer's accounting system, for example, for invoices and customer orders. Right? Next component is the processing. Now, this is the breaking down of the information provided from the input area. Right, so that's why it's saying processing. This requires the breaking down of the information provided by the inputs. Right, next component includes the storage. Now after the input has been processed, either it may be stored or it may be served as an output. So if it's stored, then storage is another important component. That is, this is the saved information in the transaction processing system's memory that may be kept in the form of ledgers. Right? And if the user wants it in the form of output, so output will also form one of the important component of transaction processing system. So what is an output? It is any generated record which may be served as the output. Right? So these are the four important components to run. These are the components, these are required to run the transaction processing system. Right? Now, when we are going to see about the functioning of this transaction processing system, we will see that these components corresponds to the functioning of the transaction processing system also. Right? Let us see the functions of transaction processing system. First, input function. Yes, as I have said, the components, those components will correspond to the functions of a transaction processing system. That is input function first. This includes the securing of data on the source document, entering of input data into the system, and also validating the data. Validating the data means, or validate the data means that the required data which will serve the purpose of the user, only that relevant data to be entered into the system. Right? So that is called validation of data. Next, processing function. Now this requires the transformation of the data, the breaking down of the data, which includes calculation, computations, so that the result can be obtained. right? Next function, storage function. Now this is the process by which the data is stored. Now this also we have seen it's correspond to the component, storage component. It entails the storage of information, accessing it, sorting it, updating it, or retrieving the stored data. Means whenever you want you can access it or retrieve it, right? And the fourth function, that is output function. So this includes the production of the processed data from the inputs in the form of report of the transaction, either through the screen, that is monitor, or it can be taken as in the form of hard copy, is the printout, or in the form of paper, right? So these are the four functions which correspond to the components of the transaction processing system. Input component for input function, processing component for processing function, storage component for storage function, output component for output function, right? Next we are going to see the types of transaction processing system. Now we are studying the types of information system. Under that we are studying transaction processing system, and under transaction processing system now we are going to see the types of transaction processing system. Let's see. Now here we are going to learn about two types of transaction processing system. One is batch processing system and another one is real-time processing system. So let us see first the batch processing system. Now processing batch transaction requires data collection and batch grouping. Now the data collected are stored in the form of batches or groups and may be processed anytime. So batch processing requires separate program for its input, process and output. And this type of transaction system, this type of transaction processing system, it's a resource saving transaction type that stores data for processing at predefined times. Means it is useful for those enterprises that need to process huge volume of data using limited resources. Right here the data will be grouped or batched, then it will be processed at a defined time. For example, it includes the customer's credit card monthly statement generation, library books overdue reminders, journal missing issues reminders, then of course important one, that is National Electronic Fund Transfer NEFT system. These will come under batch processing system. Means the data under this system will be first collected, grouped, batch will be formed, then batch wise the data will be processed. Right? Next we are coming to the real-time processing system. Now this real-time processing system, it involves continual input, process and output data. That is, it ensures instant data processing with the aim of providing a quick verification of the transaction. Here the data must be processed in a small time period or near real time. Once the system has received the data, it will process that data then and there only. So it is a highly versatile, as it can work effectively as a multi-user interface and can also be accessed anywhere where there is a network. Right? So the examples, it includes a customer who withdraws a sum of money from his bank or from his or her bank account. The account balance gets updated as and when the transaction has taken place. If you have opted for the SMS service, you will instantly receive that such and such amount has been debited or credited from your account. So then also the airline ticket booking and also the immediate payment service, that is IMPS system. That is, if you have to pay certain amount of money to another person through your IMPS system, through maintained by your bank, you can pay the amount immediately. So all this will come under the real time processing system. So here you have to remember these two types of transaction processing system. One is batch processing, another one is real-time processing. Under batch processing, the transactions are first collected and grouped to form a batch, then that batches of transaction are being processed. And under real-time processing, the time the system receives the information, it will start processing it then and there. Right? That's why it's saying it's real time. Okay, so these are the two types. Now the areas next we are going to see are the benefits or the advantages of this transaction processing system. Let us see it one by one. Now this transaction processing system keeps a stable database and reduces risk of loss of user information in the occurrence of terminal or a network failure. So the system will be, or these systems are being designed in such a way that the amount of transaction or the data that has been provided into the system before the system failure occurs, it will keep it with it. Right? So that's why the next one is saying the TPS is able to effectively recover from the operating system failure and also handle the system failures depending on what stage the transaction was in when the system failure occurred. Right? This is one of the major advantage from the part of transaction processing system. Next, TPS can process large amount or huge volume of data either in real time or batches that we have studied while we have seen the types of transaction processing system. Next, the use of transaction processing system in an organization, it's a key feature in improving the customer service and their satisfaction. Yes, when a system is processing a transaction, it will be much speedier, much faster, much more accurate, which will reduce your customer service time. Hence, it will increase the customer satisfaction, right? So that's why it's saying improving customer service and satisfaction. Next, a transaction processing system allows for the user or the customer to have a level of reliability and confidence during the transaction. Yes, this one is very important. Whatever system the organization is using to process its transaction, it should be of highly reliable and confidentiality of the transaction should be maintained. Right? So the risk of loss of the user information can be checked. Now this transaction processing is swift, means it's speedy, and of course it is cost effective as it reduces human intervention. Right? Next, the use of transaction processing system in businesses, it minimizes the occurrence of error during data transaction. Now this will depend upon the providing of input. If you provide wrong input into the system, it will process that wrong input and the output will be faulty one. So this will depend upon the accurate and correct data that has to be provided into the system for its proper functioning. If you provide the system with accurate data, it will minimize the occurrence of error. Right? And of course, this TPS or this transaction processing system, it has been designed to be user friendly so that the user can easily use it without any hurdle. Next, it is versatile as it encourages the use of online payment system in real time and increases more other payment methods usage. right? And this particular system, it can function anywhere having the network system. Yes, when we have talked about the real time processing of data, we have mentioned this. Now this means that location, geography, language or methods are not a barrier to using a transaction processing system if a network is attached with it, right? So here we have seen a couple of advantages. If a system is having certain benefits, providing certain advantages, it should have one or more limitations or disadvantages also. So let us see the disadvantages. Now here, the managing the operations under this transaction processing system, it can be complicated if the company is not big enough to efficiently use the transaction processing system. Yes, this has to be kept in mind before implementing this transaction processing system by any organization, right? Next, transaction processing system needs both the hardware and the software components to efficiently manage the high or huge number of data. This capacity makes the transaction processing system susceptible to software security, which is in the form of virus and faulty hardware issues, which may appear in the form of power outage, which can disrupt the whole system. So for that, proper backup and recovery system has to be there. This we have learned, right? So that we can overcome this particular disadvantage, right? Next, effective integration of a transaction processing system in a company. It requires skilled personnel. Now, when an organization is establishing its infrastructure to run a information system or a processing system, those work, those establishment of the processing system requires skilled and knowledgeable personnel, so that those people who understand the requirement of the organization, based on the requirement, that processing system has to be developed for that organization. It may happen the organization may require different processing system from another organization. So depending upon their requirement, depending upon the requirement of a particular organization, the people who are establishing the processing, the TPS for any organization, the infrastructure built up has to be dependent on the requirement of the organization. So that's why it's saying it also requires a link with associate company branches to maintain a secure flow of information. This high requirement can create instability and flux in the company's daily operations. So the understanding of the company's requirement, by keeping that in mind, if it has been avoided, it has been overlooked, then this system will be a failure for that particular organization. The integration of that system with other system in that company will be a total failure, right? So with this, we have covered up the most of the areas under transaction processing system, right? So in today's class, we are we have seen the one of the important type of information system, that is transaction processing system. What does it mean? Its features, its components, its functionality, its types, and its benefits, its disadvantages, right? With our next class, we are going to continue with the other types of information system, right? Thank you. We are concluding our class here.